there is an urgent need to prevent proliferation, to promote disarmament, and to preserve the gains made in these directions. And these goals are linked. Progress on one will generate progress on the other. Excellencies, let me turn to the global threat of terrorism. Nothing justifies terrorism. No cause, no grievance. Terrorism continues to take a rising toll of deaths and devastation. It is destroying societies, destabilizing regions, and diverting energy from more productive pursuits. National and multilateral counterterrorism efforts have indeed disrupted networks, reclaimed territory, prevented attacks, and saved lives. But we need to intensify this work. Stronger international cooperation remains crucial against terrorism. And I'm grateful to the General Assembly for approving one of my first reform initiatives, the establishment of the UN Office of Counterterrorism. Next year, I intend to convene the first ever gathering of heads of counterterrorism agencies of member states to forge a new international counterterrorism partnership. But it is not enough to fight terrorists on the battlefield or to deny them funds. We must do more to address the roots of radicalization, including real and perceived injustices and high levels of unemployment and grievance among young people. Political, religious, and community leaders have a duty to stand up against hatred and serve as models of tolerance and moderation. And together we need to make full use of UN instruments and expand our efforts to support the survivors. But experience has also shown that harsh crackdowns and heavy-handed approaches are counterproductive. As soon as we believe that violations of human rights and democratic freedoms are necessary to win the fight, we might have lost the war. Excellencies, third, unresolved conflicts and systematic violations of international humanitarian law. We are all shocked by the dramatic escalation of sectarian tensions in Myanmar's Rakhine State. A vicious circle of persecution, discrimination, radicalization, and violent repression has led more than 400,000 desperate people to flee, putting regional stability at risk. I take note of State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi's address today and their intention to implement the recommendations of the Advisory Committee on Rakhine State that was chaired by Kofi Annan within the shortest time possible. But let me emphasize again, the authorities in Myanmar must end the military operations, allow unhindered humanitarian access, and recognize the right of refugees to return in safety and dignity. And they must also address the grievances of the Rohingya, whose status has been left unresolved for far too long. Excellencies, no one is winning today's wars. From Syria to Yemen, from South Sudan to the Sahel, Afghanistan and elsewhere, only political solutions can bring peace. And we should have no illusions. We will not be able to eradicate terrorism if we do not resolve the conflicts that are creating the disorder within which violent extremists flourish. Last week, I announced the creation of a high-level advisory board on mediation. And those eminent individuals will allow us to be more effective in brokering peace around the world. And the United Nations is forging closer partnerships with key regional organizations, such as the African Union, the European Union, the League of Arab States, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We continue to strengthen and modernize peacekeeping, protecting civilians and saving lives around the world. And since taking office, I have sought to bring together the parties to conflict, as well as those that have influence on them. As a meaningful example, I'm particularly hopeful about tomorrow's meeting on Libya. Last month, I visited Israel and Palestine. We must not let today's stagnation in the peace process lead to tomorrow's escalation. We must restore the hopes of the peoples And the two-state solution remains the only way forward, and it must be pursued urgently. Excellencies, but I must be frank. In too many cases, the warring parties believe war is the answer. They may speak of a willingness to compromise, but their actions too often betray a thirst for outright military victory at any cost. Violations of international humanitarian law are rampant, and impunity prevails. And civilians are paying the highest price, with women and girls facing systematic violence and oppression. I've seen in my country and in my years at the United Nations that it is possible to move from war to peace and from dictatorship to democracy. Let us push ahead with a surge in diplomacy today and a leap in conflict prevention for tomorrow. Excellencies, forced climate change puts our hopes in jeopardy. Last year was the hottest ever, and the past decade has been the hottest on record. Average global temperature keeps climbing, glaciers are receding, and permafrost is declining. Millions of people and trillions of assets are at risk from rising seas and other climate disruptions. And the number of natural disasters has quadrupled since 1970. The United States, followed by China, India, the Philippines, and Indonesia, have experienced the most disasters since '95, more than 1,600, or once every 5 days. And I stand in solidarity with the people of the Caribbean and the United States. We have just suffered through Hurricane Irma, the longest-lasting Category 5 storm ever recorded. And Maria is already on its way. We should not link any single weather event with climate change. But scientists are clear that such extreme weather is precisely what their models predict will be the new normal of a warming world. We have had to update our language to describe what is happening. We now talk of mega hurricanes, superstorms, and rain bombs. And it's time to get off the path of suicidal emissions. We know enough today to act. The science is unassailable, and I urge governments to implement the historic Paris Agreement with ever greater ambition. And I commend those cities that are setting bold targets, and I welcome the initiatives of thousands of private enterprises, including major oil and gas companies that are betting on a clean, green future. Energy markets tell us that green business is good business. And the falling cost of renewables is one of the most encouraging stories on the planet today. So is the growing evidence that economies can grow as emissions go down. New markets, more jobs, opportunities to generate trillions in economic output. The facts are clear, solutions are staring us in the face, leadership needs to catch up. Cinquièmement, les inégalités croissantes minent les fondements de la société et le contrat social. L'intégration des économies mondiales, l'expansion du commerce et les avancées technologiques spectaculaires ont apporté des bienfaits remarquables. Plus de personnes se sont extirpées de la pauvreté extrême que jamais auparavant. La classe moyenne mondiale est aussi plus importante que jamais, et davantage de personnes vivent plus longtemps et en meilleure santé. Mais les progrès ne sont pas équitables. Nous voyons des disparités criantes dans les revenus, l'égalité des chances et l'accès aux résultats de la recherche et de l'innovation. 8 hommes représentent autant de richesses mondiales que la moitié de l'ensemble de l'humanité. Des régions, des
There
pays,
are
des communautés
regions and
entières restent loin des
communities
vagues de
that
progrès et de
are
croissance,
far away from
livrées à
these
eux-mêmes
waves of
dans les
growth,
Rust
left
Belts
to
de
their
notre monde.
resources
Et
in
cette
their parts of the
exclusion a un
world.
prix.
And this
Frustration,
exclusion has a price,
aliénation,
exclusion,
instabilité.
alienation and instability.
Mais nous avons un plan visant à
But
changer
we
le
have a
cap
plan
pour
to
parvenir à une
change course
mondialisation équitable.
and bring about
Ce
fair
plan est le
globalization.
programme
And that plan
2030.
is the
Mesdames et
2030
messieurs, la
agenda.
moitié de notre monde
Ladies and gentlemen,
est de
half
sexe féminin.
of our world
La
is
moitié de notre
female.
monde a moins de
Half of our
25 ans.
world is
Nous ne
under
pouvons pas
25
atteindre
years
les
old.
objectifs de
We
développement
can't wait for
durable
the
sans
sustainable
tirer parti
development
du pouvoir des
goals
femmes et nous appuyer sur
before
l'énorme
we
énergie
address
des jeunes.
the issue
Et nous
of
savons à
women
quelle
and
vitesse
energy
peut
of young
s'opérer la
people,
transformation
and we
de nos
know
jours.
how quickly we need to
Nous
move.
savons qu'avec une richesse
We
et
know
des actifs
that
mondiaux équivalent à
with
des milliards, nous ne
billions
sommes pas en
in,
manque de financement.
assets. It's
Trouvons
not
la
money that we're
sagesse
lacking. What we
d'utiliser
need
les
is
outils,
wisdom.
les
We need
plans
to
et
use
les
the
ressources
tools, the
déjà
plans
entre nos
and the
mains
resources that
pour
we
parvenir à
already
un
have
développement
to
durable et
bring
bénéfique
about
à tous.
sustainable
Un
development that will
objectif en
benefit
soi,
everyone.
mais
This
aussi
is an
notre
objective in
meilleur
itself,
instrument
but it's
de
also our
prévention
best
des
instrument
conflits.
to prevent conflicts.
Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen,
Mesdames et messieurs,
ladies and
le côté
gentlemen,
obscur de l'innovation est la sixième menace que nous devons affronter. Il est
innovation
passé de la frontière à la
is
porte
something
d'entrée.
that we must
La technologie
address.
continuera d'être au cœur des
Technology
progrès
will
partagés.
continue to be at the
Mais
heart
l'innovation,
of
aussi
shared
essentielle soit-elle
technology,
pour
but
l'humanité,
innovation, as essential as it
peut
is for
avoir des
humanity,
conséquences
can
imprévues.
have unforeseeable
Les menaces
consequences.
liées à la
Threats
cybersécurité
linked to
s'accentuent.
cybersecurity
La
are
guerre
on the increase.
cybernétique devient de moins en moins
Internet
une réalité cachée.
war is
Elle est de
increasingly
plus en
out in
plus
the
capable
open.
de
It's
perturber les
increasingly
relations
able
entre
to
États
disturb
et de détruire
relations between
centaines des
states
structures
and
et des
to
systèmes de la vie
destroy
moderne.
hundreds of
Les
structures
progrès
of
dans le
modern life.
cyberespace peuvent certes
Progress
autonomiser les
in
personnes,
cyberspace
et
certainly
ce qu'on appelle la
should give
dark
people
web
more freedom,
montre que
but the
certains
dark web
utilisent
is
ce
showing that some
potentiel
people
pour
use this
nuire et
potential
asservir.
to harm
L'intelligence
others and
artificielle
serve
est une nouvelle
themselves.
donnée qui peut
Artificial
stimuler le
intelligence is
développement et
something that
améliorer
can
les
stimulate
conditions de
development
vie
and
de
improve
façon
living
spectaculaire.
conditions in a spectacular
Mais elle peut
fashion.
aussi avoir un
But
effet
it can also
dramatique
have
sur les
a
marchés de
dramatic
travail et
effect
en fait
on
sur la
work
société
life and
mondiale
on
et sur le
global
tissu social
society and
même.
on the very social
Le génie
fabric of
génétique est passé
society.
des pages de la science-fiction au marché.
Genetic
il a
engineering
engendré
is
de
now
nouveaux
becoming a
dilemmes
reality, but
éthiques
it has
non
given rise
résolus.
to unresolved
À
new
moins qu'elle ne soit
ethical
traitée de manière
dilemmas
responsable,
unless it's dealt with in a
ces avancées
responsible
pourraient
way.
causer des dommages
This
incalculables.
progress could cause incalculable
Señoras y
damage.
señores,
Ladies and
los
gentlemen,
gobiernos y las organizaciones
governments
internacionales
and international
sencillamente no
organizations
están
are
preparados
quite
para esta
simply
nueva
not
situación.
prepared for this new
Las
situation.
formas tradicionales de regulación
traditional
simplemente ya no son
Forms
válidas.
of regulating
Está
affairs
claro
are no
que este
longer
tipo de
valid.
tendencias
Clearly,
y
these kinds of
capacidades
trends
exige
and
una nueva
capacities
generación
require
de pensamiento
a
estratégico,
new
de
strategic
reflexión
thinking,
ética
a
y de
new
regulación.
ethical way of thinking
Las
and
Naciones
regulating
Unidas
these
están
affairs.
dispuestas a ser
The
un
United
foro
Nations is
en el que
prepared
los
to be a
Estados
forum
miembros, la
where
sociedad
member
civil,
states, civil
las empresas y
society,
el mundo académico puedan
companies
reunirse
and
y
the
hablar
academic
sobre el
world
camino a
can meet
seguir
together
en
to discuss the
beneficio
way
de
forward
todos.
that will benefit everyone.
Excellencies, finally, I want to talk about human mobility, which I do not perceive as a threat, even if some do. I see it as a challenge that, if properly managed, can help bring the world together. Let us be clear. We do not only face a refugee crisis, we also face a crisis of solidarity. Every country has the right to control its own borders, but that must be done in a way that protects the rights of people on the move. Instead of closed doors and open hostility, we need to reestablish the integrity of the refugee protection regime and the simple decency of human compassion. With a truly global sharing of responsibility, the number of refugees we face can be managed. But too many states have not risen to the moment. And I commend those countries that have shown admirable hospitality to millions of forcibly displaced people. We need to do more to support them. And we also need to do more to face the challenges of migration. The truth is that the majority of migrants move in a well-ordered fashion, making positive contributions to their host countries and homelands. It is when migrants move in unregulated ways that the risks become clear. Risks for states, but most especially risks for migrants themselves exposed to perilous journeys. Migration has always been with us. And climate change, demographics, instability, growing inequalities, and aspirations for a better life, as well as unmet needs in labor markets, mean it is here to stay. And the answer is effective international cooperation in managing migration to ensure that its benefits are most widely distributed and that the human rights of all concerned are properly protected. From my experience, I can assure you that most people prefer to realize their aspirations at home. But we must work together. Development cooperation must be oriented in a way to make sure that they can do so. Migration should be an option, not a necessity. And we also need a much stronger commitment of the international community to crack down on human traffickers and to protect their victims. But let's be clear, we will not end the tragedies on the Mediterranean, the Andaman Sea and elsewhere without creating more opportunities for regular migration. These will benefit migrants and countries alike. I myself am a migrant, as are many of you in this room. But no one expected me to risk my life on a leaky boat or to cross a desert in the back of a truck to find employment outside my country of birth. Safe migration cannot be limited to the global elite. Refugees, internally displaced persons, internally displaced persons and migrants are not the problem. The problem lies in conflict, persecution, and hopeless poverty. And I've been pained to see the way refugees and migrants have been stereotyped and scapegoated, and to see political figures stoke resentment in search of electoral gain. In today's world, all societies are becoming multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. And this diversity must be seen as a richness, not as a threat. But to make diversity a success, we need to invest in social cohesion, so that all people feel that their identities are respected and that they have a stake in the community as a whole. Excellencies, we need to reform our world, and I'm committing to reforming the United Nations. Together, we have embarked on a comprehensive reform effort to build a UN development system to support states in bettering people's lives, to reinforce our ability to safeguard people's peace, security, and human rights, and to embrace management practices that advance those goals instead of hindering them. We have launched a new victim-centered approach to preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, and we have a roadmap to achieve gender parity at the United Nations, and we are already on our way. Excellencies, we are here to serve, to relieve the suffering of we the peoples, and to help fulfill their dreams. We come from different corners of the world. Our cultures, religions, and traditions vary widely, and I would say wonderfully. At times, there are competing interests among us. At others, there is even open conflict. And that is exactly why we need the United Nations. And that is exactly why multilateralism is today more important than ever. We call ourselves the international community. We must act as one, because only together, as United Nations, can we fulfill the promise of the Charter and advance human dignity for all. Thank you, shukran, xie, merci, spasiba, gracias, bem-aja.
I thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for his presentation. The General Assembly will now turn to Agenda Item 8, entitled General Debate. Before I deliver my statement, I want to express our solidarity with the people of Dominica who suffered the devastation of Hurricane Maria overnight. Our thoughts are with the others bracing for her impact. Many of them just come through the passage of Hurricane Irma. Distinguished heads of state and governments, distinguished ministers, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome you all to New York for the general debate of the 72nd session of the General Assembly. I wish, however, that I could deliver a speech today which is different to the one I prepared. I wish I could point to a long list of examples of mediation and early action, successfully averting conflicts. I would prefer to talk only about people who move and migrate out of choice, not desperation. It would be great to congratulate you all for meeting your climate-related commitments and for relegating extreme poverty to the history books. I hope that someone will eventually be able to deliver such a speech from this marble podium, but it cannot be me today. Instead, conflict persists as an ugly reality of our world. Civilians, not soldiers, are paying the highest price. Schools and hospitals, not military barracks, are the targets of attacks. I must also talk today about over 65 million people leaving their homes because they are forced to do so, not because they want to. I have to use my speech today to address other major challenges, including persistent poverty, growing inequalities, indiscriminate terrorist attacks, and worsening effects of climate change. These are global challenges. Every country is coping with at least one, but they are also individual in nature, touching on the lives of each person. That is not to say that there is nothing to celebrate today. We have made a collective promise to humanity by signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals. We have rallied in support of peace agreements, such as the one that we saw in Colombia. We have said enough is enough when it comes to climate change by signing the Paris Agreement. But we are not here today to dwell on our past achievements. We are here to look ahead. We will hear visions, ideas, and yes, criticisms and concerns over the coming week. These will chart the course of the United Nations as it works to address the most urgent global challenges. I'm confident that they will also travel home with you and influence your work as the world's leaders. I will now myself start the ball rolling by outlining my vision for the 72nd session. First, peace and prevention should be at the center of everything the United Nations does. Because if you read the UN Charter, there are only 5 references to war. The word peace, however, appears 47 times. Unfortunately, we are spending too much time and money reacting to conflicts and not enough on preventing them. We need to recalibrate our efforts around peace and prevention. That is the only way to ensure that the United Nations is doing the job for which it was created. And I want to be clear, placing peace and prevention first is not about requesting more capacity from the outside. The United Nations already has most of the tools it needs. What we are missing are the conditions in which they can be properly used. And the sustaining peace resolutions should be at the top of our toolbox. They challenge us to strengthen our response to crises before they result in the outbreak or recurrence of conflict. They called for a renewed focus on prevention. For this vision to come to life, these resolutions must be implemented, and I hope to contribute to this process during my presidency. Prevention must become a greater part of the General Assembly's work. This will be important in our ongoing review of the UN peace operations and our engagement with the United Nations First Office on Counterterrorism. Prevention must also be better integrated into human rights and development. When people can live decent lives, when rights are respected, when rule of law is present in everyday life, it is harder to turn societies to conflict. Second, a stronger focus must be placed on people. This is because the United Nations was not made for diplomats or dignitaries. It was made for people. We know that many people have become disillusioned. Countless others around the world, however, have high hopes for us. They see the United Nations blue flag as a first sign of safety and the beginning of change. One of the biggest tests for us will be the process to adopt the first global compact on migration. And let me be frank here, this will be a difficult process. The issue of migration is highly divisive. We all have a different opinion on it. But we cannot turn this into an exercise of bureaucracy. We cannot be left with an agreement that works only on paper. Another major challenge that demands a focus on people is international terrorism. This is not a problem that can be solved with guns or shut out by barriers. People are at its center. They are the ones contributing to it. They are the ones suffering because of it. The only way to succeed in both areas will be through choosing to focus on people rather than rigidly sticking to our individual positions. We need viable global frameworks which can be implemented by people and for people in real time. But I want to stress one thing. We cannot fail. If we do, how can we claim that the United Nations is the best forum in which to address global challenges? Those who are cynical about the UN will be proven right, and others will find it hard to hold on to their hope. A focus on people must also be more strongly felt in the humanitarian field. The UN access and help to those in dire need cannot be compromised by any party. Violations of international humanitarian law are too common, and accountability for these crimes is too rare. Finally, we must keep the promises we have made to advance the prosperity and protect the planet. Through the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement, we made a clear commitment. We promised to improve the lives of all people and secure the future of the planet we live on. However, we will not be able to achieve this without securing enough finances. So we cannot sit and wait patiently for trillions of dollars to materialize. We must go out and search for them. And this will involve more engagement with the private sector and financial institutions. I see the priority clusters of peace and prevention, people, and planet and prosperity as three sides of a triangle. They might not all be the same length or the same width, but one is as important as the other. And I'm confident that this triangle will point in the direction of promising prospects for our world. Excellencies, let us not forget other important issues that need to be mainstreamed. Human rights are crucial. Neither peace nor development can take hold without them. We must remember that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to gender equality. Women's leadership and participation should be a priority in setting of both conflict and peace. United Nations reforms will also be a main priority. There must be open and inclusive dialogue among member states regarding the Secretary General's reform proposals. I will work to facilitate this. And I will also personally engage closely with member states to strengthen the role of the General Assembly. And I will promote a credible process to address the reform of the Security Council. Finally, the United Nations should be opening its doors wider. We must strengthen our engagement with a wide variety of stakeholders, including regional and sub-regional organizations, civil society, and the private sector. And we need to hear more young voices in this hall. Excellencies, before I conclude, allow me to make a personal observation. I want to say that we cannot call for an end to a business as usual and then continue to do business as usual. If we are looking for a change in how the UN operates around the world, we should start here in New York. This can mean institutional change, but it can also mean a change in the way we work on a daily basis. We can engage in a real dialogue, not a succession of monologues. We can concentrate on how much and not how little we can give up in the spirit of compromise. We can look beyond our individual agendas and positions and see the bigger picture of why the United Nations is here and what it is trying to do. I may not have been able to deliver a happy statement today, praising us all for making the world a better place to live in. But I will work throughout this year to increase the chances that someday one of my successors will have this great privilege. I wish you success in your deliberations, which I'm confident will be in the interest and to the benefit of all people. I thank you. Before giving the floor to the first speaker for this morning, I'd like to remind members that the list of speakers for the general debate has been established on the agreed basis that statements should be no longer than 15 minutes to enable all the speakers to be heard at a given meeting. Within this time frame, I would like to appeal to speakers to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace so that interpretation in the other official United Nations languages may be provided properly. I would also like to draw your attention to the decision taken by the General Assembly at previous sessions, namely that the practice of expressing congratulations inside of the General Assembly hall after a speech has been delivered is strongly discouraged. In this connection, after delivering their statements, speakers are invited to exit the General Assembly hall through the room GA200, located behind the podium, before returning to their seats. May I take it that the General Assembly agrees to proceed in the same manner during the general debate of the 72nd session? It is so decided. Finally, I should like to draw to the attention of members that during the general debate, official photographs of all the speakers are taken by the Department of Public Information. Members interested in obtaining these photographs are requested to contact the photo library of the United Nations. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Michel Temer, President of the Federative Republic of Brazil. I request protocol to escort His Presidency, His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Michel Temer, President of the Federative Republic of Brazil, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Senhor Miroslav Lajčák, presidente
Dear Miroslav
da Assembleia
Lajčák,
Geral das Nações Unidas,
President of the United Nations
Senhor
General
Antônio
Assembly,
Guterres,
Mr. Antonio
secretário-geral das
Guterres,
Nações
Secretary
Unidas,
General of the United States,
senhoras e
United Nations
senhores chefes de
Organization,
Estado, de
ladies
governo
and gentlemen, heads
e
of
de
state, heads of
delegações,
government and heads of
senhoras e senhores,
delegations, ladies
eu
and
quero,
gentlemen
inicialmente,
at large. First of
cumprimentar
all, I
o
wish
presidente da
to
Assembleia Geral
congratulate the President of the
por sua
General
eleição.
Assembly for his
Conte,
recent
senhor
election.
presidente,
Mr. President, you
apoio
can
da
certainly
delegação
count
brasileira.
on the ongoing support of
Apraz-me ainda
the Brazilian delegation.
saudar
It also
o
gives me great
secretário-geral
pleasure to
em idioma
greet
que nos é
the
comum.
Secretary General in a
Senhor
language that is common to
secretário-geral,
both of us,
eu
Portuguese.
quero
Dear Secretary General,
reiterar
may I
meus
once
votos
again
de
reiterate
continuado
my
êxito
best
no
wishes for
exercício do seu
continued
mandato.
success
Senhor
in your
presidente,
mandate at
têm
the
sido
helm
muitos
of the UN.
os
Mr.
desafios
President, many have been the
enfrentados
challenges
pelas Nações
facing
Unidas
the United
desde a
Nations
sua
ever
criação.
since it was founded.
E sabemos todos
And we all
que
know
não se cumpriram
that
plenamente
the aspirations
as aspirações de seus
of
fundadores.
its founders have
Mas
not
a
been entirely
verdade
fulfilled.
é que nestes mais de 70 anos,
But the fact
a
is,
ONU
nevertheless, that in the
continuou
past 70
e
plus
continua
years, the UN
representando a
has
esperança.
continuously
A verdade
stood for
é
and
que a
represented
ONU
hope. The fact
continuou
is
e
that the UN
continua
has
representando a
continuously
possibilidade
represented
de mundo mais
the
justo,
possibility, the
mundo de
prospects
paz
for a more just
e de
world,
prosperidade,
a world of peace and
mundo
prosperity,
em que
a
ninguém
world
tenha
where no one
que sujeitar-se à
has to
discriminação,
subject oneself
à
to
opressão,
discrimination,
à miséria,
to oppression, or
em que os
to
padrões de
extreme
produção e
poverty.
consumo
A world where production
sejam
and consumption
compatíveis
patterns are
com o
fully
bem-estar
in line with the
das
well-being
gerações
of both
presentes
present
e
and
futuras.
future generations.
A ONU, meus senhores e senhoras,
Dear
já se
friends, ladies and
confirmou
gentlemen, the UN
como
has
espaço
as such
privilegiado
affirmed itself
para a
as a
construção
special forum
desse
for
mundo
building
que
this
almejamos.
world to which we all aspire.
Construção que requer
And the task at
método
hand
e
requires
realismo,
proper methods
sem
and a
nunca
sense of
perder de
realism
vista
without ever
os
losing
nossos
sight
ideais.
of our ideals.
Neste momento da
At
história,
this time in history,
tão marcados
marked by
traços
so
de
much
incerteza
uncertainty and
e
instability,
instabilidade, necessitamos
we need
de mais
more
diplomacia
diplomacy,
e negociação,
more negotiating,
nunca menos.
not less.
De mais
We need
multilateralismo
more of the
e
multilateral
diálogo,
system and more
nunca
dialogue,
menos.
not less.
Certamente
Today, we
necessitamos
certainly
de mais ONU.
need
e de uma ONU que tenha
UN more
cada
than
vez
before.
mais
And I'm talking about the
legitimidade
UN that is
e
increasingly
eficácia.
legitimate and
Não por outra razão,
Accordingly,
sustentamos, ao lado de
together with
tantos outros
so many
países,
other countries,
o imperativo de reformar as
advocate
Nações
that it is
Unidas.
imperative to
É
reform the United Nations
particularmente
organization,
necessário
particularly
ampliar o Conselho de Segurança
the need
para
to
ajustá-lo
expand the
às
Security
realidades
Council
do
so as to align
século
it
XXI.
with the
Urge
reality of the 21st
ouvir
century.
o anseio da
It is
grande
absolutely
maioria
pressing that we be
desta
able to
Assembleia.
hear the vast majority of voices
Senhor presidente,
of this
não é
assembly.
razoável supor
Mr.
que ideias
President,
que no
it
passado
is not reasonable
já se mostraram
to assume
equivocadas
that ideas
possam
that already
agora
have proven
render
mistaken in the past
bons frutos.
may now yield
Nós recusamos
good fruits.
os nacionalismos
We reject
exacerbados.
exacerbated forms
Não
of nationalism.
acreditamos
We do
no
not
protecionismo
believe in
como
protectionism
saída
as a
para as
way out
dificuldades
or a
econômicas.
potential solution to economic
Dificuldades que
difficulties.
demandam respostas
Difficulties that
efetivas
actually require
para
effective
as causas profundas
answers
da exclusão social.
so as to successfully tackle the
A
deep
busca do desenvolvimento
causes
em
of social
todas as suas
exclusion.
dimensões
The quest
deve
for
nortear
development in all of its
nossa
dimensions
ação coletiva.
should ultimately guide our
O
collective
compromisso do
action.
Brasil com o desenvolvimento
Brazil's
sustentável
commitment towards
é de primeira
sustainable
hora.
development is top on our
Permeia
agenda.
nossas
As
políticas
such, it cuts
públicas
through our
e
public
nossa
policies
atuação
and
externa.
our foreign action.
Na presidência
At the chair
da comunidade
of
dos
the
países de língua
Portuguese-speaking
portuguesa.
community
Por
of
exemplo,
countries, for example,
elegemos
we
a
have
Agenda
chosen the
2030
2030 development
como
agenda
eixo
as the
de nossas
main
atividades.
driver of our efforts
Todas as
in that
frentes,
forum.
o Brasil
On all
procura
fronts,
dar sua
Brazil has
contribuição
sought to give its
para os
contribution
objetivos do
to
desenvolvimento
achieving the
sustentável.
sustainable development goals.
Contribuição que
A
necessariamente
contribution that
inclui o combate
inevitably
à mudança do clima.
includes tackling climate change.
Seguiremos empenhados
We
na
shall
defesa
remain
do Acordo de
committed to
Paris.
advocating the Paris Agreement.
No ano passado, aqui
Last
mesmo,
year,
em Nova York,
Right here in New
depositei
York,
o
On
instrumento de
behalf of Brazil, I
ratificação
deposited
do acordo pelo
Brazil's
Brasil.
ratification instrument in support
Essa
of the Paris
é
Agreement.
matéria que não comporta
This
adiamento.
is a matter that
que
cannot
agir
possibly
já.
be postponed. We
Meu
must
país,
act now.
e é com satisfação que eu digo,
My country, and I am
está
pleased to say
na
this,
vanguarda do
is at the
movimento
very
em
forefront
direção
of the movement
a uma economia de baixo
towards a
carbono.
low-carbon economy.
A energia limpa
Clean
e
and
renovável
renewable
no
energy
Brasil
in Brazil
representa mais de
accounts for more than
40% de nossa matriz
40%
energética.
of our energy
Três
mix.
vezes a média
And that is
mundial.
3 times more
Somos
than the world's
líderes
average.
em energia
We
hídrica
are leaders
e em
in
bioenergia.
hydropower and
O Brasil,
bioenergy.
senhoras e senhores,
Ladies and gentlemen,
orgulha-se
Brazil is
de
proud
ter
to
a maior
have
cobertura de
the
florestas
largest
tropicais do
tropical
planeta.
forest coverage on the
O
planet.
desmatamento é questão que
Deforestation
nos preocupa,
is a matter of concern to us,
especialmente na Amazônia.
particularly in the Amazonian
Nessa
region.
questão,
It is an
temos
issue on
concentrado
which we have
atenção
focused attention
recursos.
and to which we have
pois
allocated
trago
funds and
a boa
resources.
notícia
And I
de
have,
que os primeiros
good
dados
news to you,
disponíveis para o último ano
i.e. the fact that
já
the most
indicam
recent
a
data available
diminuição
for last year
de
already
mais de
show
20%
a more
do
than
desmatamento
20%
naquela
reduction
região.
in deforestation in the Amazonian region.
Retomamos
We have,
bom
therefore,
caminho.
resumed the right
E
path,
nesse caminho
and we
persistiremos.
shall persist in it.
Outro importante vetor
Yet another
desenvolvimento
driver of development
é o comércio.
is trade.
Nosso engajamento é
We
por um sistema de
are
comércio
committed
internacional
to an international
aberto
trade
e
system that
baseado em
is
regras.
open
Um sistema
and
que
rules-based.
tem por centro
A system that is
a
ultimately
Organização Mundial do
centered
Comércio
on the World
e
Trade
seu
Organization
mecanismo
and
de solução de
its
controvérsias.
dispute settlement mechanism.
Na conferência ministerial
In the
Buenos
upcoming
Aires,
Buenos
em dezembro,
Aires ministerial meeting of
teremos
the WTO
uma
in
vez
December,
mais
we will
que
once
enfrentar
again have to face up
pendências
to
antigas.
old pending
pendências
issues. And
que
these are pending
prejudicam,
issues that have
sobretudo,
proved detrimental
países
mainly
em
to
desenvolvimento.
developing countries.
Teremos que avançar
We will
no
have to make
acesso
progress
a mercado de
on
bens
access
agrícolas,
to markets
na eliminação de
for agricultural
subsídios
goods,
à agricultura
as well as on eliminating
distorce o
trade
comércio.
distortive agricultural
Confiamos
subsidies.
que,
We do trust
juntos,
that together
saberemos
we
produzir
will rise to
resultados.
the occasion and be able to deliver
Todos
good
esses
results.
esforços concorrem para
All of these
aquele
efforts
que é nosso
converge
propósito maior,
to foster our
assegurar
overarching purpose,
oportunidades para
i.e.
todos,
to ensure opportunities
em
will be
todas as
available to
partes.
all and everywhere.
Senhor presidente,
Mr.
eu
President,
terei a honra
tomorrow
de assinar
I will
amanhã
have the honor of
o
signing
Tratado sobre
the
a
Treaty on
Proibição
the Prohibition
de Armas
of
Nucleares.
Nuclear Weapons.
O Brasil
Brazil
esteve
was one
entre
of
os
the
artífices do
countries
tratado.
that joined
Será
the
momento
task of
histórico.
drafting the treaty. It will certainly be a
Reiteramos
historical
nosso
moment.
chamado a que as potências
We reiterate our
nucleares
call for
assumam
nuclear powers
compromissos
to take on
adicionais de
additional
desarmamento.
disarmament obligations.
O Brasil manifesta-se
In this regard,
com a autoridade
Brazil
de quem,
expresses herself
dominando a
authoritatively
tecnologia
as a country
nuclear,
that, while
abriu mão
mastering nuclear technology,
voluntariamente de
has
possuir
voluntarily
armas
given
nucleares.
up owning
O Brasil
nuclear weapons.
pronuncia-se com a autoridade
Brazil expresses
de
herself
país
authoritatively
cuja
as a
própria
country whose
Constituição
constitution
veda
itself
o uso
bans
da tecnologia
the use
nuclear
of nuclear
para
technology
fins não
for
pacíficos.
non-peaceful
Um
purposes.
país que esteve na
A
origem
country that was
do,
at the very
do
origin
Tratado
of
de
the
Tlatelolco,
Tlatelolco
que há meio
Treaty,
século
which
estabeleceu
half a century
a
ago
desnuclearização
established
da América Latina e do
denuclearization of
Caribe.
Latin America and the
E um
Caribbean.
país
A country
que, com seus vizinhos
that, working
sul-americanos e
together with
africanos,
its South American
fez
and African
também do
neighbors,
Atlântico Sul
has turned
área
the South
livre
Atlantic
de armas
into an area
nucleares.
free of
E
nuclear
país,
weapons.
enfim,
A country
que
that
com a
has
Argentina
worked with
estabeleceu
Argentina, for example,
mecanismo
to establish a
binacional
binational
de
nuclear
salvaguardas
safeguards
nucleares
mechanism
que se tornou,
which has
convenhamos,
become a
referência
benchmark
para o mundo.
for the world at
Ao
large. I'm
marcarmos
sure
a
you will agree
conquista,
with me.
que é o Tratado sobre a Proibição
As we celebrate
de
the
Armas
achievement
Nucleares,
of the
cumpre,
Treaty on the
contudo,
Prohibition of Nuclear
reconhecer
Arms
perduram
or Weapons,
na
one must,
agenda de
however,
paz e segurança
recognize that there are
questões que
lingering
suscitam
issues
fundada
of real
apreensão.
concern on the peace and
Os
security
recentes
agenda.
testes nucleares e
The recent
missilísticos na
nuclear and
Península
missile
Coreana
tests on the
constituem
nuclear,
grave ameaça,
whether on the
a qual nenhum de
Korean
nós
Peninsula,
pode estar
constitute a
indiferente.
serious threat to which none of
O
us
Brasil
can possibly
condena
be
com
indifferent.
toda a veemência
Brazil
esses
condemns
atos.
these acts on
É
the
urgente
strongest possible terms.
definir
It is urgent
encaminhamento
to engage
pacífico para a
in
situação
steps
cujas
towards a peaceful solution
consequências
to
são
the current
imponderáveis.
situation the consequences
Do
of
Oriente
which are
Médio,
imponderable.
toma a liberdade de dizê-lo,
In the Middle
as
East, if I may
tratativas
say so,
entre Israel e a Palestina
talks between Israel and
encontram-se
Palestine are
paralisadas.
currently ground to a halt.
Amigo de palestinos e israelenses,
As a friend of both
o Brasil
Palestinians and
segue
Israelis,
favorecendo a
Brazil
solução de
continues
dois
to favor the
estados,
two-state solution
convivendo em
formula,
paz
living
e
in peace
segurança
and security
dentro de fronteiras
within the internationally
reconhecidas e
and
mutuamente
mutually agreed
acordadas.
borders.
Na Síria, meus
In
senhores,
Syria,
apesar da desescalada
ladies
dos
and
últimos
gentlemen,
meses,
despite the de-escalation
ainda
of the past
se
few months,
assiste a
we are
conflito
still witnessing a
com
conflict
consequências humanitárias
of dramatic
dramáticas.
humanitarian
A solução que
consequences.
se deve buscar
The solution to
é
be sought
essencialmente
out in
política
Syria is
e
essentially
já não
political
pode ser
in nature
postergada.
and can no longer be postponed.
Também no Afeganistão,
Likewise,
na
in
Líbia, no
Afghanistan,
Iêmen, no
in
Mali,
Libya, in
ou na
Libya, in
República
Yemen, in Mali,
Centro-Africana,
or in the
as
Central
guerras causam
African
sofrimentos
Republic, wars
intoleráveis
have caused
e,
intolerable
naturalmente,
suffering
ultrapassam
that
fronteiras.
has obviously gone way beyond national borders.
Percorramos os campos de refugiados e
Let us visit
deslocados
and
no
walk through
Iraque, na
the fields of
Jordânia, no
refugees and
Líbano, no
displaced
Quênia.
people in Iraq,
Ouçamos as
Jordan,
histórias
Lebanon,
dos
and
que
Kenya.
perderam
Let us
pais,
hear the
mães,
stories of
filhos,
those who have
filhas.
lost their fathers, mothers,
São famílias
sons, and daughters.
que foram tragadas
Families that
pela
have been dragged
irracionalidade
away by
de
irrational
disputas
conflicts
que parecem
that
não
seem
conhecer limites.
to know
De
no
disputas
limits.
que, com frequência inaceitável,
Conflicts
se
that
materializam
are truly
ao arrepio
unacceptable and
do
that have
direito
all too
humanitário.
often taken place
Tem razão
on the wrong side
o
of
nosso
humanitarian law.
secretário-geral.
Our Secretary General is right.
Os
Let us work
mecanismos
to
de prevenção de
reinvigorate
conflitos.
conflict
A prevenção
prevention mechanisms.
passa pela
And
diplomacia,
prevention involves
passa
diplomacy,
pelo
and it
desenvolvimento.
also includes development.
É crucial,
It is key
indispensável,
and essential
reconhecer o
to
nexo entre
recognize
segurança
the clear-cut
e
connection between
desenvolvimento.
security and development.
O reconhecimento desse
A
nexo
clear recognition
guiou
of
a
this
participação do
connection
Brasil
has guided
na
Brazil's participation
estabilização
in the UN
das Nações Unidas
Stabilization
no
Mission
Haiti.
in Haiti, the MINUSTAH
Nessa hora em
meeting,
que a
or
MINUSTAH
mission.
encerra seu
At this
mandato,
point in time,
a comunidade
when the
internacional
MINUSTAH completes its
deve
mandate,
manter o
the
compromisso
international
com o povo
community
haitiano.
must uphold its commitment
O Brasil
to the Haitian
certamente o
people.
fará.
Brazil will certainly
Na
do
América
so.
do Sul, a Colômbia
South America,
está equacionando
Colombia is currently
conflito de
overcoming
mais de 50 anos.
A conflict that has lasted
O
for more
Brasil
than 50
continuará
years
sendo
on end.
parceiro
Brazil
decidido
will remain
nesse
a
esforço.
fully resolute and
Senhor
committed partner
Presidente,
in this effort.
senhoras e senhores,
Mr. President, ladies and
de
gentlemen,
Barcelona a Cabul,
from
de
Barcelona to
Alexandria a
Kabul,
Manchester,
from Alexandria to
reiteradas
Manchester,
manifestações
repeated
de
episodes
violência
of
covarde
cowardly
não nos
violence
deixam esquecer o
do not
mal
allow us
do
to
terrorismo.
forget the evil
É mal
of terrorism.
que se alimenta dos
It is an evil
fundamentalismos
that has
e da
fed
exclusão.
itself
Aqui
on
nenhum
different forms of
país
fundamentalism
está
and
imune.
exclusion, to which
A
no
União
country is
se
immune.
impõe ainda mais
It
em
is
face da
even more
capacidade do
imperative that we join
terrorismo
efforts,
de
given
adaptar-se aos
terrorism's
tempos
ability to
e aos
adapt itself
terrenos.
to current times and different
Não
terrains.
seremos acuados
We
pelo
shall not be
terror,
cornered away
nem
by terror,
permitiremos
nor
que ele
shall we
abale
allow it
a
to
nossa
weaken
crença na
our
liberdade
belief
e
in
na
freedom
tolerância.
and intolerance.
Também, meus senhores e minhas senhoras,
Likewise,
o
ladies
crime
and gentlemen,
transnacional em
transnational
tantos de
crime
nossos países
in so many of our
solapa
countries
a segurança
undermines
e a tranquilidade dos indivíduos
security and the
e
peace
das
of mind
famílias.
of individuals and
Apenas de
families.
forma coordenada
Only
e articulada,
through coordinated and
daremos
properly
combate
concerted action
eficaz
will we
ao
effectively
tráfico de
tackle
pessoas, de
trafficking in
armas,
persons,
de drogas, à
arms,
lavagem de ativos.
drugs, and
Foi
money
nesse espírito
laundering.
que o Brasil
It
organizou,
was in this spirit
em
that
novembro
Brazil
último,
organized
reunião
back
ministerial de países da América do Sul
in November
sobre
2016 a
segurança
ministerial meeting
nas
of South
fronteiras.
American countries on
E é
border
nesse espírito
security.
que
And
seguiremos
it is in that same spirit
cooperando
that we'll
com
keep
países
on
de
cooperating
todo o mundo
with
no
countries from all
enfrentamento
over the
do
world in
crime
efforts to
organizado.
successfully tackle
Senhor
organized
Presidente,
crime.
Lamentavelmente,
Mr. President,
ainda são
regrettably,
recorrentes
however,
as violações dos direitos
human
humanos
rights
em todo o
violations
mundo,
remain a recurrent
tanto dos direitos
fact,
civis e
both
políticos,
regarding civil
quanto dos
and
direitos
political
econômicos,
rights, as well as
sociais
economic,
e culturais.
social, and cultural
Em todos os
rights.
lugares, há que garantir que cada
It is
indivíduo
necessary to
possa
ensure
viver
that
com
everywhere
dignidade,
individuals be
segundo
able to
suas
live in dignity
convicções e
according
suas
to their
escolhas.
own convictions and
O
choices.
Brasil é um país de
Brazil
liberdades
is a
arraigadas,
country of
que se
deep-seated
fez
liberties,
e ainda se
a country
faz
that made
na
itself
diversidade.
and still does
Diversidade
so
na etnia,
amidst
na cultura, no
diversity,
credo, de pensamento,
diversity in terms of
mais que
ethnic
tudo.
background, culture,
É dessa
creed, and
diversidade
thought.
que tiramos nossa força
More than anything
como
else,
nação.
it is from this
Rechaçamos
diversity
o
that we
racismo,
derive our
a
strength
xenofobia
as a
e
nation.
todas as
We
formas
reject
de discriminação.
racism, we reject xenophobia
Somos
and
parte
all forms of
nos
discrimination.
principais tratados
Brazil is party
internacionais
to
de direitos humanos,
the main
na
international
Corte
human rights
na
treaties. We're
Interamericana
also party
de
to
Direitos
the
Humanos, no Tribunal Penal
Inter-American Human
Internacional.
Rights Court. to the
Estendemos
International
convite
Criminal Court as
permanente
well.
aos relatores
We have
independentes da ONU.
extended a permanent invitation to the
Temos
UN
hoje,
independent
meus
rapporteurs.
senhores, uma das leis
Currently,
de
we
refugiados
have
mais
one
modernas
of
do
the
mundo.
world's most
Acabamos
advanced
de modernizar
laws on
também
refugees.
a nossa
Also,
lei de
we have
migração,
recently updated our migration
pautados
law,
pelo princípio
anchored
da
on the
acolhida
principle
humanitária.
of humanitarian
Temos
response
concedido vistos
and
humanitários
aid.
a cidadãos
We have
haitianos e
granted
sírios.
humanitarian
E
visas
temos
to both
recebido
Haitian and Syrian
milhares de
nationals.
imigrantes
Likewise, we
e
have received
refugiados da
thousands of
Venezuela.
migrants and refugees
A
from
situação
Venezuela.
dos direitos humanos na Venezuela,
The human rights
lamentavelmente,
situation in Venezuela
continua a deteriorar-se.
has
Estamos ao lado do
regrettably
povo
deteriorated
venezuelano,
continuously.
a
We
quem nos
stand by and
ligam
support the Venezuelan people,
vínculos
to whom we are
fraternais.
linked by brotherly
Já não há mais
connections.
espaço para alternativas
There is
à
no more
democracia.
room for alternatives to
É o
democracy.
que afirmamos no Mercosul.
And that is
É o que
precisely what we
seguiremos
have asserted in
defendendo.
Mercosur, and it is also what we
Senhor
will keep on
Presidente,
advocating.
O Brasil
Mr.
atravessa
President,
momento
Brazil is
de
currently going
transformações
through a period of
decisivas.
decisive
Com
and
reformas
sweeping
estruturais,
changes.
estamos superando uma crise
With structural
econômica
reforms, we
sem
are
precedentes.
overcoming an
Estamos
unprecedented
resgatando
economic crisis.
o equilíbrio fiscal
We
e,
are
com ele,
currently restoring
a credibilidade da
fiscal balance and,
economia.
by extension,
Voltamos a gerar
economic
emprego,
credibility. Jobs are
recobramos
being created
a capacidade do
again. We have
Estado
recovered the
de levar
state's
adiante
ability to carry
políticas
out
sociais
key
indispensáveis
social
em um
policies
país como o
in a
nosso.
country like ours.
Aprendemos
We have learned the
e
lesson,
estamos aplicando
and we are
na prática
applying in practice
esta regra
this
elementar.
elementary
Sem
rule,
responsabilidade
i.e. the rule
fiscal,
that without
a
fiscal
responsabilidade
responsibility,
social
social
não
responsibility
passa de
is
discurso
nothing
vazio.
but empty
O novo
rhetoric.
Brasil está surgindo das
The new
reformas,
Brazil that is now
é um país
emerging
mais aberto ao
from
mundo.
recent reforms is
Essa
a country
atitude de
that is more
abertura
open to the world.
que trazemos à ONU
It is
e que
this
levamos ao
attitude of
Mercosul, ao
openness that
G20, ao
we bring to
BRICS,
the
ao
UN,
IBAS e a
which we
todos
have
os
also taken
foros
to Mercosur,
de que
G20,
participamos.
BRICS, IBSA, and to
Essa
all
atitude
of
de
the fora
abertura
in which we take
que
part.
adotamos com
It
cada
is
de
this
nossos
attitude of
parceiros,
openness that we have
na nossa
adopted
região
to
e
each
além
of our
dela.
partners in our
A
region
América do
and
Sul
beyond it.
é nossa vizinhança
South America
imediata.
is our
Por
immediate
isso
neighborhood.
trabalhamos por uma
And for
América
that
do
reason,
Sul
we have worked
próspera
for
e
a
democrática.
prosperous and democratic
Trabalhamos pela
South America.
crescente
We have
convergência
worked
dos processos de integração
for
na
increasing
América Latina
convergence of
e no
integration
Caribe.
processes in Latin
Exemplo
America and the Caribbean.
significativo
A
é a
significant
aproximação
example
entre o
thereof
Mercosul
are the
e a
currently
Aliança
closer
do
ties
Pacífico.
between Mercosur and the
Juntos,
Pacific
os
Alliance.
países desses dois agrupamentos
Together, the
formam
countries
um
of these
mercado de quase 470
Two
milhões
different groups
de
make up a
pessoas
market of nearly
que respondem
470
por
million
mais de
people,
90%
which
do
accounts
PIB da América
for more than
Latina.
90% of Latin America's
África,
GDP.
por sua vez, é
Africa, in
continente
turn, is a
a que nos
continent
unem
to
fortes
which we are
laços
united by
históricos e
strong
culturais.
historical
É
and cultural
continente
ties.
onde
Africa is a
queremos
continent
cada vez
where
mais
we wish to
iniciativas de
have
cooperação,
increasing
cada vez mais
cooperation initiatives
parcerias
and increasing
para o
partnerships
desenvolvimento.
for development.
Com a Europa, onde
With
cultivamos
Europe,
antigas
we
amizades,
have cultivated
tratamos de
long-standing
incrementar
friendship
os
ties,
fluxos
and
de
there
comércio
we have worked to
e
boost
investimentos.
trade and
E
investment
também na
flows.
Ásia Pacífico,
Likewise,
polo
in Asia
mais
and the Pacific
dinâmico
region,
da economia global,
the most vibrant
intensificamos
hub
nossas
of the
relações
global economy,
com parceiros
we have stepped up
tradicionais
our relations
e
with
abrimos
both
novas
traditional partners
frentes
and new
de
ones. We have
intercâmbio.
also opened up new trade
Assim é
fronts with Asia and
a
the
nossa
Pacific.
política externa,
Thus has been our foreign policy,
verdadeiramente universalista.
a truly
Senhor
universalist
Presidente,
foreign
o mais
policy.
universal
And,
dos
Mr.
foros
President, the fact
do
is
que
that the
contamos
most
é
universal
esta
of
Assembleia
all
Geral.
fora we have
Aqui,
and can count on
nos
is this General
beneficiamos
Assembly.
do mais
Here
plural
we can all
conjunto de
benefit from the
perspectivas.
broadest and the
Aqui,
most pluralistic
encontramos os
array
parâmetros
of perspectives.
e as normas
Here we
para o
find
convívio
the
respeitoso.
parameters and the
Aqui
standards that
haveremos
govern
de
our
nos tornar
respectful living
nações
together.
mais
Here we
unidas
shall become
em nome
more
do
united
desenvolvimento de nossos
nations,
povos,
aiming
da
at the ultimate
dignidade
development of
de
our
nossos
peoples,
cidadãos,
the dignity of
da
our citizens,
segurança
and
de
the
nosso
security
planeta.
of
Muito
our
obrigado,
planet.
senhor presidente,
Thank you very
senhoras e
much,
senhores.
Mr.
Muito
Chairman.
obrigado.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Federative Republic of Brazil for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Donald Trump, President of the United States of America. I request protocol to escort His Presidency, His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Donald Trump, President of the United States of America, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, world leaders, and distinguished delegates, welcome to New York. It is a profound honor to stand here in my home city as a representative of the American people to address the people of the world. As millions of our citizens continue to suffer the effects of the devastating hurricanes that have struck our country, I want to begin by expressing my appreciation to every leader in this room who has offered assistance and aid. The American people are strong and resilient, and they will emerge from these hardships more determined than ever before. Fortunately, the United States has done very well since Election Day last November 8th. The stock market is at an all-time high, a record. Unemployment is at its lowest level in 16 years, and because of our regulatory and other reforms, we have more people working in the United States today than ever before. Companies are moving back, creating job growth the likes of which our country has not seen in a very long time. And it has just been announced that we will be spending almost $700 billion on our military and defense. Our military will soon be the strongest it has ever been. For more than 70 years, in times of war and peace, the leaders of nations, movements, and religions have stood before this assembly. Like them, I intend to address some of the very serious threats before us today, but also the enormous potential waiting to be unleashed. We live in a time of extraordinary opportunity. Breakthroughs in science, technology, and medicine are curing illnesses and solving problems that prior generations thought impossible to solve. But each day also brings news of growing dangers that threaten everything we cherish and value. Terrorists and extremists have gathered strength and spread to every region of the planet. Rogue regimes represented in this body not only support terrorists, but threaten other nations and their own people with the most destructive weapons known to humanity. Authority and authoritarian powers seek to collapse the values, the systems, and alliances that prevented conflict and tilted the world toward freedom since World War II. International criminal networks traffic drugs, weapons, people, forced dislocation and mass migration, threaten our borders, and new forms of aggression exploit technology to menace our citizens. To put it simply, we meet at a time of both immense promise and great peril. It is entirely up to us whether we lift the world to new heights or let it fall into a valley of disrepair. We have it in our power, should we so choose, to lift millions from poverty, to help our citizens realize their dreams, and to ensure that new generations of children are raised free from violence, hatred, and fear. This institution was founded in the aftermath of 2 world wars to help shape this better future. It was based on the vision that diverse nations could cooperate to protect their sovereignty, preserve their security, and promote their prosperity. It was in the same period, exactly 70 years ago, that the United States developed the Marshall Plan to help restore Europe. Those 3 beautiful pillars, they're pillars of peace, sovereignty, security, and prosperity. The Marshall Plan was built on the noble idea that the whole world is safer when nations are strong, independent, and free. As President Truman said in his message to Congress at that time, our support of European recovery is in full accord with our support of the United Nations. The success of the United Nations depends upon the independent strength of its members. To overcome the perils of the present and to achieve the promise of the future, we must begin with the wisdom of the past. Our success depends on a coalition of strong and independent nations that embrace their sovereignty to promote security, prosperity, and peace for themselves and for the world. We do not expect diverse countries to share the same cultures, traditions, or even systems of government, but we do expect all nations to uphold these 2 core sovereign duties: to respect the interests of their own people and the rights of every other sovereign nation. This is the beautiful vision of this institution, and this is the foundation for cooperation and success. Strong sovereign nations let diverse countries with different values, different cultures, and different dreams not just coexist, but work side by side on the basis of mutual respect. Strong sovereign nations let their people take ownership of the future and control their own destiny. And strong sovereign nations allow individuals to flourish in the fullness of the life intended by God. In America, we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example for everyone to watch. This week gives our country a special reason to take pride in that example. We are celebrating the 230th anniversary of our beloved Constitution, the oldest Constitution still in use in the world today. This timeless document has been the foundation of peace, prosperity, and freedom for the Americans and for countless millions around the globe whose own countries have found inspiration in its respect for human nature, human dignity, and the rule of law. The greatest in the United States Constitution is its first 3 beautiful words. They are, "We the people." Generations of Americans have sacrificed to maintain the promise of those words, the promise of our country and of our great history. In America, the people govern, the people rule, and the people are sovereign. I was elected not to take power, but to give power to the American people where it belongs. In foreign affairs, we are renewing this founding principle of sovereignty. Our government's first duty is to its people, to our citizens, to serve their needs, to ensure their safety, to preserve their rights, and to defend their values. As President of the United States, I will always put America first, just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. All responsible leaders have an obligation to serve their own citizens, and the nation-state remains the best vehicle for elevating the human condition. But making a better life for our people also requires us to work together in close harmony and unity to create a more safe and peaceful future for all people. The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return. As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else. But in fulfilling our obligations to our own nations, we also realize that it's in everyone's interest to seek a future where all nations can be sovereign, prosperous, and secure. America does more than speak for the values expressed in the United Nations Charter. Our citizens have paid the ultimate price to defend our freedom and the freedom of many nations represented in this great hall. America's devotion is measured on the battlefields where our young men and women have fought and sacrificed alongside of our allies. From the beaches of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Asia. It is an eternal credit to the American character that even after we and our allies emerged victorious from the bloodiest war in history, we did not seek territorial expansion or attempt to oppose and impose our way of life on others. Instead, we helped build institutions such as this one to defend the sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. For the diverse nations of the world, this is our hope. We want harmony and friendship, not conflict and strife. We are guided by outcomes, not ideology. We have a policy of principled realism rooted in shared goals, interests, and values. That realism forces us to confront a question facing every leader and nation in this room. It is a question we cannot escape or avoid. We will slide down the path of complacency, numb to the challenges, threats, and even wars that we face. Or do we have enough strength and pride to confront those dangers today so that our citizens can enjoy peace and prosperity tomorrow? If we desire to lift up our citizens, if we aspire to the approval of history, then we must fulfill our sovereign duties to the people we faithfully represent. We must protect our nations, their interests, and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. We must uphold respect for law, respect for borders, and respect for culture, and the peaceful engagement these allow. And just as the founders of this body intended, we must work together and confront together those who threaten us with chaos, turmoil, and terror. The scourge of our planet today is a small group of rogue regimes that violate every principle on which the United Nations is based. They respect neither their own citizens nor the sovereign rights of their countries. If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior. We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East. We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors. The entire world understands that the good people of Iran want change. And other than the vast military power of the United States, that Iran's people are what their leaders fear the most. This is what causes the regime to restrict internet access, tear down satellite dishes, shoot unarmed student protesters, and imprison political reformers. Oppressive regimes cannot endure forever, and the day will come when the people will face a choice. Will they continue down the path of poverty, bloodshed, and terror, or will the Iranian people return to the nation's proud roots as a center of civilization, culture, and wealth, where their people can be happy and prosperous once again? The Iranian regime's support for terror is in stark contrast to the recent commitments of many of its neighbors to fight terrorism and halt its financing. In Saudi Arabia early last year, I was greatly honored to address the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations. We agreed that all responsible nations must work together to confront terrorists and the Islamic extremism that inspires them. We will stop radical Islamic terrorism because we cannot allow it to tear up our nation and indeed to tear up the entire world. We must deny the terrorists safe haven, transit, funding, and any form of support for their vile and sinister ideology. We must drive them out of our nations. It is time to expose and hold responsible those countries who support and finance terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and others that slaughter innocent people. The United States and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists and stop the reemergence of safe havens they use to launch attacks on all of our people. Last month, I announced a new strategy for victory in the fight against this evil in Afghanistan. From now on, our security interests will dictate the length and scope of military operations, not arbitrary benchmarks and timetables set up by politicians. I have also totally changed the rules of engagement in our fight against the Taliban and other terrorist groups. In Syria and Iraq, we have made big gains toward lasting defeat of ISIS. In fact, our country has achieved more against ISIS in the last 8 months than it has in many, many years combined. We seek the de-escalation of the Syrian conflict and a political solution that honors the will of the Syrian people. The actions of the criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, including the use of chemical weapons against his own citizens, even innocent children, shock the conscience of every decent person. No society can be safe if banned chemical weapons are allowed to spread. That is why the United States carried out a missile strike on the airbase that launched the attack. We appreciate the efforts of the United Nations agencies that are providing vital humanitarian assistance in areas liberated from ISIS, and we especially thank Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon for their role in hosting refugees from the Syrian conflict. The United States is a compassionate nation and has spent billions and billions of dollars in helping to support this effort. We seek an approach to refugee resettlement that is designed to help these horribly treated people and which enables their eventual return to their home countries to be part of the rebuilding process. For the cost of resettling one refugee in the United States, we can assist more than 10 in their home region. Out of the goodness of our hearts, we offer financial assistance to hosting countries in the region, and we support recent agreements of the G20 nations that will seek to host refugees as close to their home countries as possible. This is the safe, responsible, and humanitarian approach. For decades, the United States has dealt with migration challenges here in the Western Hemisphere. We have learned that over the long term, uncontrolled migration is deeply unfair to both the sending and the receiving countries. For the sending countries, it reduces domestic pressure to pursue needed political and economic reform and drains them of the human capital necessary to motivate and implement those reforms. For the receiving countries, the substantial costs of uncontrolled migration are borne overwhelmingly by low-income citizens whose concerns are often ignored by both media and government. I want to salute the work of the United Nations in seeking to address the problems that cause people to flee from their homes. The United Nations and African Union led peacekeeping missions to have invaluable contributions in stabilizing conflicts in Africa. The United States continues to lead the world in humanitarian assistance, including famine prevention and relief in South Sudan, Somalia, and northern Nigeria and Yemen. We have invested in better health and opportunity all over the world through programs like PEPFAR, which funds AIDS relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Global Health Security Agenda, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and the Woman Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, part of our commitment to empowering women all across the globe. We also thank the Secretary General for recognizing that the United Nations must reform if it is to be an effective partner in confronting threats to sovereignty, security, and prosperity. Too often, the focus of this organization has not been on results, but on bureaucracy and process. In some cases, states that seek to subvert this institution's noble aims have hijacked the very systems that are supposed to advance them. For example, it is a massive source of embarrassment to the United Nations that some governments with egregious human rights records sit on the UN Human Rights Council. The United States is one out of 193 countries in the United Nations, and yet we pay 22% of the entire budget and more. In fact, we pay far more than anybody realizes. The United States bears an unfair cost burden, but to be fair, if it could actually accomplish all of its stated goals, especially the goal of peace, this investment would easily be well worth it. Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell. But the powerful people in this room, under the guidance and auspices of the United Nations, can solve many of these vicious and complex problems. The American people hope that one day soon the United Nations can be a much more accountable and effective advocate for human dignity and freedom around the world. In the meantime, we believe that no nation should have to bear a disproportionate share of the burden, militarily or financially. Nations of the world must take a greater role in promoting secure and prosperous societies in their own regions. That is why in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has stood against the corrupt, destabilizing regime in Cuba and embraced the enduring dream of the Cuban people to live in freedom. My administration recently announced that we will not lift sanctions on the Cuban government until it makes fundamental reforms. We have also imposed tough, calibrated sanctions on the socialist Maduro regime in Venezuela, which has brought a once thriving nation to the brink of total collapse. The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible pain and suffering on the good people of that country. This corrupt regime destroyed a prosperous nation by imposing a failed ideology that has produced poverty and misery everywhere it has been tried. To make matters worse, Maduro has defied his own people, stealing power from their elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule. The Venezuelan people are starving, and their country is collapsing. Their democratic institutions are being destroyed. This situation is completely unacceptable, and we cannot stand by and watch. As a responsible neighbor and friend, we and all others have a goal. That goal is to help them regain their freedom, recover their country, and restore their democracy. I would like to thank leaders in this room for condemning the regime and providing vital support to the Venezuelan people. The United States has taken important steps to hold the regime accountable. We are prepared to take further action if the government of Venezuela persists on its path to impose authoritarian rule on the Venezuelan people. We are fortunate to have incredibly strong and healthy trade relationships with many of the Latin American countries gathered here today. Our economic bond forms a critical foundation for advancing peace and prosperity for all of our people and all of our neighbors. I ask every country represented here today to be prepared to do more to address this very real crisis. We call for the full restoration of democracy and political freedoms in Venezuela. The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented. From the Soviet Union to Cuba to Venezuela, wherever true socialism or communism has been adopted, it has delivered anguish and devastation and failure. Those who preach the tenets of these discredited ideologies only contribute to the continued suffering of the people who live under these cruel systems. America stands with every person living under a brutal regime. Our respect for sovereignty is also a call for action. All people deserve a government that cares for their safety, their interests, and their well-being, including their prosperity. In America, we seek stronger ties of business and trade with all nations of goodwill. But this trade must be fair and it must be reciprocal. For too long, the American people were told that mammoth multinational trade deals, unaccountable international tribunals, and powerful global bureaucracies were the best way to promote their success. But as those promises flowed, millions of jobs vanished and thousands of factories disappeared. Others gamed the system and broke the rules. And our great middle class, once the bedrock of American prosperity, was forgotten and left behind. But they are forgotten no more, and they will never be forgotten again. While America will pursue cooperation and commerce with other nations, we are renewing our commitment to the first duty of every government, the duty of our citizens. This bond is the source of America's strength and that of every responsible nation represented here today. If this organization is to have any hope of successfully confronting the challenges before us, it will depend, as President Truman said some 70 years ago, on the independent strength of its members. If we are to embrace the opportunities of the future and overcome the present dangers together, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. Nations that are rooted in their histories and invested in their destinies. Nations that seek allies to befriend, not enemies to conquer. And most important of all, nations that are home to patriots, to men and women who are willing to sacrifice for their countries, their fellow citizens, and for all that is best in the human spirit. In remembering the great victory that led to this body's founding, we must never forget that those heroes who fought against evil also fought for the nations that they loved. Patriotism led the Poles to die to save Poland, the French to fight for a free France, and the Brits to stand strong for Britain. Today, if we do not invest ourselves, our hearts, and our minds in our nations, if we will not build strong families, safe communities, and healthy societies for ourselves, no one can do it for us. We cannot wait for someone else, for faraway countries or far-off bureaucracies. We can't do it. We must solve our problems to build our prosperity, to secure our future, or we will build vulnerable to decay, domination, and defeat. The true question for the United Nations today, for people all over the world who hope for better lives for themselves and their children, is a basic one. Are we still patriots? Do we love our nations enough to protect their sovereignty and to take ownership of their futures? Do we revere them enough to defend their interests, preserve their cultures, and ensure a peaceful world for their citizens? One of the greatest American patriots, John Adams, wrote that the American Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. That was the moment when America awoke, when we looked around and understood that we were a nation. we realized who we were, what we valued, and what we would give our lives to defend. From its very first moments, the American story is the story of what is possible when people take ownership of their future. The United States of America has been among the greatest forces for good in the history of the world, and the greatest defenders of sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. Now we are calling for a great reawakening of nations, for the revival of their spirits, their pride, their people, and their patriotism. History is asking us whether we are up to the task. Our answer will be a renewal of will, a rediscovery of resolve, and a rebirth of devotion we need to defeat the enemies of humanity and unlock the potential of life itself. Our hope is a word and world of proud, independent nations that embrace their duties, seek friendship, respect others, and make common cause in the greatest shared interest of all, a future of dignity and peace for the people of this wonderful earth. This is the true vision of the United Nations, the ancient wish of every people, and the deepest yearning that lives inside every sacred soul. So let this be our mission, and let this be our message to the world. We will fight together, sacrifice together, and stand together for peace, for freedom, for justice, for family, for humanity, and for the Almighty God who made us all. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the United States of America for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President, after which the meeting will stand suspended for 5 minutes before resuming to hear the next speaker.